I rented the cabin in late October, thinking the solitude would give me a chance to reset. It was tucked into a narrow valley, far enough from the main road that no one would notice I was there unless they knew exactly where to look. The trees were shedding the last of their leaves, the ground a patchwork of brown and orange, damp from recent rains. The air had that sharp, metallic chill that comes just before winter, and the sky was heavy with low clouds that made everything feel muted. I arrived in the late afternoon, carrying only my backpack, a small duffel, and a thermos of coffee. The cabin sat at the end of a gravel path that crunched under my feet, and its exterior was weathered, with gray wood darkened by moisture. It smelled faintly of mold and wood polish, a sharp contrast to the crisp air outside. Inside, the cabin was sparse but livable. A single room served as kitchen and living area, with a wood stove in the corner, a small table with 2 chairs, and a couch that sagged in the middle. A narrow hallway led to a bedroom and a bathroom, both small and functional. I spent the first hour unpacking, lighting the stove, and stacking firewood in a neat pile. The sound of the logs settling and the soft crackle of the stove became a steady background rhythm. I took my coffee to the window and watched the woods, noticing how still everything was. The leaves barely moved, and the wind that had been strong on the road here seemed to die once it hit the valley. I felt an odd mixture of relief and tension, the kind that comes from being alone in a place no one visits. As the light faded, the cabin grew dim. The windows were old, with uneven panes that distorted the last rays of sun. I lit a lamp and moved around methodically, checking that the stove door was closed, the firewood stacked for easy access, the windows locked. I had my phone, but the signal was weak, and I didn't bother trying to call anyone. The silence of the valley pressed against the cabin walls, soft at first but insistent, filling every corner. I reminded myself it was just isolation, nothing more. Around 9, I noticed a subtle change. The wind picked up in the trees outside, carrying the sharp scent of wet earth and rotting leaves. It wasn't loud, but it had a rhythm that didn't match the natural patterns I'd heard earlier. I paused in the kitchen, listening. There was a faint dragging sound coming from the gravel path outside, soft but deliberate, like someone walking slowly and carefully. My first thought was that it was an animal, maybe a deer or a raccoon rummaging in the fallen leaves. I went to the window, but the clouded panes distorted everything. The path looked empty. I told myself it was imagination. The mind tends to invent shapes in the dark. I went back to the living area and tried to focus on reading, but the sound persisted intermittently. It wasn't consistent. Sometimes there was nothing, then a soft scrape across gravel, then silence again. I found myself walking to the window every few minutes, peering into the dim clearing, noticing shadows that didn't seem to belong to trees. Once, I swore I saw a figure crouched near the tree lean, but when I blinked, it was gone. I forced myself to sit down, telling myself I was tired and the imagination preys on fatigue. By midnight, the sounds were closer. I couldn't place what it was. Footsteps or something being dragged. The gravel pathway outside now seemed alive with movement, irregular and slow, as if someone was pacing. I moved toward the bedroom to check the locks on the doors. Each step across the wooden floor echoed in a way that felt unnaturally loud. I ran my hands over the door frames, confirmed the locks, the windows, even the stove. I felt safer, but only a little. Every so often, a thump or scrape would make me jump. The valley was supposed to be empty, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone, or something, was observing the cabin from the shadows just beyond the tree lean. Sleep was impossible. I tried lying down, covering my head with a blanket, counting the crackle of the stove. Every now and then, a noise from outside, a scrape, a shift, a muted footstep, made me freeze. I didn't dare look. At one point, I saw a movement in the corner of my eye, a shadow crossing the room as if the dim lamplight was reacting to something outside. I forced myself to focus on the floor, my hands gripping the blanket. Hours passed like this, and by dawn, the noises had stopped. The wind outside had calmed, the clouds breaking into pale sunlight. I stood by the window, scanning the path. There was no sign of anyone, No footprints, no drag marks, no disturbance of leaves beyond the natural scatter. The forest looked harmless and empty in the morning light. I packed quickly, feeling a weight in my chest I couldn't shake. As I loaded my bag into the car, I noticed faint marks along the gravel path. They were small, shallow, irregular, and seemed partially erased by the wind and fallen leaves. Not enough to confirm anything, but enough to make me quicken my pace to the road. I didn't stop driving until I reached the first town. The familiarity of pavement, streetlights, and other people washing some of the tension from my body. Later, I thought about the cabin and the noises, trying to make sense of them. Perhaps it was an animal, a transient person, or even a combination of natural sounds amplified by isolation and stress. Couldn't know. The uncertainty, more than any visible danger, was what stuck with me. Weeks later, I returned briefly to collect forgotten items. The cabin looked normal, empty, as if nothing had happened. No marks on the path, no disturbance, just quiet trees and the faint scent of damp wood. I left quickly, realizing that the fear I had felt wasn't rooted in anything tangible I could point to. It was simply the vulnerability of being alone in a remote place, the way isolation can turn the familiar into something alien. I never returned to that valley. Couldn't. The experience left a quiet awareness in me, a reminder of how quickly comfort can shift to anxiety when the walls are thin, the forest is close, and the mind is left to fill the silence with possibilities. The memory of the dragging sound, soft and slow, lingered longer than the landscape itself, a warning I didn't need anyone else to understand. I've told myself repeatedly that it was nothing, that the cabin was harmless. But every time I think about that night, I feel the tension in my chest, the weight of someone or something moving just outside, waiting silent until it chose not to be. And that is enough to keep me away for good. I had planned the cabin trip for weeks. I wanted a break from the city, a chance to disappear into the woods, away from people, from noise, from everything. The cabin itself was small, built decades ago on the edge of a dense forest. It sat on a slight rise overlooking a lake that reflected the gray sky in patches of dull silver. The place had been advertised as isolated but cozy. In hindsight, I realized isolated and safe were not the same thing. I arrived late in the afternoon. The gravel driveway crunched under my tires as I parked next to the cabin. The air was sharp and cold, carrying the smell of wet pine and decaying leaves. The trees around the cabin were tall, bare in places where winter had already begun its slow creep. Shadows pooled in the underbrush, the kind that made the hair on your arms stand up when you realized just how alone you were. I carried my backpack in, noting the small stove, a few shelves with dusty dishes, and a woodpile stacked neatly against the wall. Everything was functional but not polished, and that roughness was part of the appeal. I spent the first hour unpacking, laying out food, filling the small kettle, and stacking firewood. The sun was sinking low when I lit the first fire. The flames flickered against the wooden walls, sending shadows twisting in the corners. I settled into a chair facing the fire, the only sound the occasional pop of sap in the logs and the distant lapping of the lake. It felt peaceful, almost too peaceful, like the forest was holding its breath. Night fell quickly. Without city lights or distant traffic, the darkness pressed in hard, and every little sound seemed magnified. An animal rustled somewhere close, leaves snapping underfoot. I told myself it was a deer or a fox, nothing more. I drank some water, checked the lock on the door, and moved to bed. The cabin's bed was firm, not uncomfortable, and I drifted off under the thick quilt. Around 2 a.m., I woke to a faint sound, a scrape or thump that came from outside. My first thought was the wind, but the sound was deliberate. It came again, a slow scraping, soft but distinct. I stayed still, straining to hear, and realized it was circling the cabin, moving along the perimeter. My heart started to beat faster. The cabin was small. I could see every shadow, every tree silhouette pressed against the windows. I turned on a small flashlight, sweeping the beam over the yard. Nothing, just the trees, the lake in the distance, the rocks and leaves that the wind occasionally tossed. I tried to convince myself it was an animal, maybe a raccoon or a deer, but then I noticed the fire had dimmed more than it should have. The kettle I had left boiling on the stove was overturned on the counter. The water spilled across the wood floor. I remembered distinctly leaving it full and steady. Panic started to edge in, cold and sharp. The scraping sound returned, closer now, almost under the windows. My mind raced, imagining someone, an intruder, approaching, but there was nothing outside the beam of the flashlight. I grabbed a hatchet from where I had left it by the firewood and moved carefully toward the door. I didn't unlock it. I just tested the handle from the inside. Locked, thankfully. The scraping stopped. I pressed myself against the wall, listening. Nothing. The cabin smelled faintly of burnt wood and spilled water, the chill in the air settling into my bones. Hours passed, though it felt like minutes, and eventually, exhaustion took me again. I lay on the bed, the hatchet within reach, every shadow in the cabin magnified in my mind. When I woke, the morning light filtered weakly through the windows, and the forest outside looked calm and indifferent. I felt foolish for my fear the night before, telling myself it had been animals, maybe a branch falling on the roof, or a deer rubbing against the side. I brewed coffee, warming my hands around the mug, and made breakfast. I spent the day hiking along a narrow path that followed the lake. The woods were quiet, the only sound my boots crunching leaves, and the occasional bird calling out. But the isolation started to press on me, a slow dread that grew with every step. I tried to shake it off, telling myself I was imagining things, that the fear was part of being alone in a place like this. That evening, I returned to the cabin and noticed something I hadn't before. A set of footprints in the soft earth near the back of the cabin. They weren't animal tracks. Human, large, heavy. I froze, my stomach twisting. They led from the tree-line to the edge of the porch and disappeared under the cabin itself. I hadn't seen anyone, hadn't heard anyone, but there they were, clear and deliberate. My hands shook as I retrieved the hatchet again. I stayed awake that night, sitting by the fire, listening. Every time the wind moved through the trees, every time a branch fell, my heart jumped. Around midnight, I heard something shift outside the window. Heavy footsteps, careful and slow, circling the cabin. I didn't breathe, didn't move, gripping the hatchet with white knuckles. The sound stopped. I waited. Then it came again. A single knock against the door, soft but firm. My stomach dropped. I realized I couldn't stay. There was no way to call for help with cell service so unreliable, and even if I could, how long would it take for someone to arrive? I needed to leave now while there was still some light to guide me out. I packed everything I could carry quickly, leaving food and water behind, and checked every lock. I took one last look at the cabin, its wooden walls worn and solid, and slipped out the back door, moving quietly toward my car. The forest felt endless as I moved, the moon hidden behind clouds. Every crackle of leaves, every branch snapping underfoot, made me jump. I kept to the narrow path I had followed earlier, forcing myself to focus on the distant lights of the road. I didn't stop until I was back in the car, doors locked, engine running, and the road stretched before me like salvation. Driving away, I didn't slow until I reached the first town. The sun was just rising, painting the sky pale orange. I glanced in the rearview mirror, the trees of the forest receding into the distance, and felt a deep, trembling relief. The cabin was still there, quiet, waiting, but I knew I wouldn't go back. Some solitude is safe, some is not. That trip had taught me the difference. I never saw anyone, never heard anyone in daylight, but the tracks, the sounds, the overturned kettle, they were proof enough that being truly alone in a place like that can be more dangerous than any story could warn. I never returned to that cabin. The lake, the trees, the forest, they looked peaceful from the road, harmless. But I knew better now. I knew what it felt like to be watched, to hear deliberate steps in the dark when no one should be there. I didn't tell anyone about the trip. It was mine alone, a lesson in fear, caution, and respect for the quiet places we sometimes take for granted. I rented the cabin on a quiet stretch of forest road, far from the nearest town. It was advertised as secluded and rustic, which I understood as a promise of silence and solitude. The cabin sat at the edge of a small clearing, surrounded by thick pine and oak trees. The dirt driveway was uneven, scattered with rocks and fallen branches, and I had to drive slowly to avoid scraping the car. The wooden exterior was weathered and gray, the paint peeling in long strips, and a thin wisp of smoke curled from the chimney. The whole place had a smell of damp wood, moss, and years of forest that had pressed against it like a living thing. I arrived late in the afternoon, the sun low behind the trees, casting long shadows that made the cabin appear smaller, almost hidden. I unloaded my gear and stacked it near the door, taking note of the woodpile, a small table with chairs, and the narrow path that led down to the lake at the edge of the clearing. Inside, the cabin was compact and sparsely furnished. There was a small kitchen with a stove and sink, shelves with a few dishes, and a table by the window. The bedroom was tiny, a mattress on a simple frame, a small dresser, and a window that looked out toward the forest. Everything was usable, but worn, with scratches on the floorboards and faint stains on the counters. The imperfections didn't bother me. They made the place feel real, lived in, and quiet. I unpacked slowly, setting out food and water, stacking firewood near the small stove, and checking the locks on the doors. The air inside was cooler than outside, a mix of damp wood and the faint metallic scent of the stove. I lit the fire, watching the flames leap and curl, the shadows dancing on the walls. Outside, the forest was already turning dark. I could hear the wind moving through the branches, the occasional rustle of leaves, and the soft lapping of the lake against the shore. The sounds were subtle, but they pressed into my awareness in a way city noise never did. Night fell quickly, darker than I expected. Without streetlights or passing cars, the forest seemed to swallow the clearing, and every movement outside became noticeable. Around midnight, I woke to the sound of something shifting near the cabin. At first, I thought it was the wind, but the sound was deliberate, scraping along the side of the cabin, slow and careful. I stayed still, listening, the hair on my arms rising. It came again, circling the cabin, moving closer to the door. I gripped the fire poker, moving quietly to the window to peer outside. The forest was black, shapes of trees blending into one another. There was nothing visible, but I could feel something watching. The scraping stopped. I told myself it must have been an animal, a deer or a raccoon, maybe a branch falling. I tried to go back to sleep, but the tension kept me awake, and I found myself listening to the small noises of the cabin. The fire crackling, the wood settling, the faint drip of water from the sink. Hours passed in this uneasy half-sleep until the first light of dawn filtered through the window. Morning revealed the cabin bathed in a soft gray light. The forest looked calm, innocent even, the shadows retreating with the sun. I stepped outside, stretching and taking a careful survey of the area. That's when I noticed the footprints. Large, heavy, human. They led from the edge of the clearing to the back door of the cabin and stopped abruptly. I had seen no one, heard nothing, but the evidence was clear. My stomach tightened. I checked every lock, every window. Everything seemed undisturbed beyond that. But the footprints had unsettled me more than the night sounds ever could. I spent the day hiking along the edge of the lake, trying to shake off the fear. The water was still, reflecting the gray sky, and the forest felt empty but alive. Every few steps, I would glance over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone watching from the trees, but there was nothing. The isolation, which had felt like a relief on arrival, now pressed against me, heavy and constant. The air smelled of wet earth and decaying leaves, sharp and pungent, and the silence was absolute except for my own breathing and the occasional splash of a fish breaking the water's surface. That night, the forest felt different. The wind carried a faint crunch of dry leaves, but there was a pattern to it, like deliberate movement. I stayed close to the fire, the hatchet I had brought with me lying within arm's reach. Around midnight, the sound returned, slow, methodical, circling the cabin, closer and closer to the windows. I didn't move, didn't breathe, my eyes tracing the shadows that the fire cast on the walls. I could hear a faint knock at the door, soft but deliberate. My heart pounded, and I realized I had to leave. I packed quickly, leaving food and supplies behind. Every movement was deliberate, careful, and quiet. I checked all the locks, grabbed the hatchet, and stepped outside. The forest was dark, thick with trees, and the narrow path to the car seemed endless. I forced myself to keep moving, careful not to make unnecessary noise, watching the shadows for any sign of movement. Each snap of a branch underfoot made me flinch, my senses stretched tight. I reached the car just as the first pale light of dawn began to push through the trees. My hands shook as I started the engine, glancing back once at the cabin, its walls dark and quiet, the clearing empty. I drove slowly, the road winding through the forest, the isolation of the place leaving a mark on me. By the time I reached the first signs of civilization, I felt the tension in my body begin to ease, though a sense of vigilance remained, subtle but persistent. The cabin had been real, solid, and quiet, but it had also been a place where I had felt observed, vulnerable. I never returned. The forest, the lake, the path, they looked peaceful from the road, but I knew better. There had been someone there, or something, close enough to leave footprints and overturn a kettle, yet invisible. The experience stayed with me, a lesson in solitude and caution, a reminder that some places carry a quiet danger that no advertisement, no description, can ever truly convey. The forest had seemed empty, indifferent, and yet it had left me shaken in a way I could not explain with words alone. I never rented another isolated cabin after that. I stuck to places with neighbors nearby, the faint hum of civilization always in the background. The memory of that night, the footsteps circling, the dark pressing against the walls, stayed with me for years. It wasn't a story to tell for thrills, but a reminder of the tension that comes from being alone in a place designed for solitude. I knew now that isolation has a weight, and that weight can become fear in the quietest of moments. I needed to get away. After a brutal breakup and months of staring at city walls, I booked a week at a small, isolated cabin in northern Maine. The idea of a quiet, empty forest promised something I hadn't felt in a long time. Freedom from other people's expectations, freedom from noise, freedom from my own restless thoughts. The drive north was long, winding through strip malls, gas stations, and endless stretches of pine that gradually grew taller and denser. GPS signal flickered and vanished as I left paved roads behind, forcing me down narrow dirt paths that twisted through foggy stands of trees. By the last 5 miles, the road was little more than 2 ruts carved into the earth, flanked on both sides by towering evergreens. Low fog clung to the ground, curling around trunks and roots, and the headlights only revealed the next 10 feet. The air smelled sharp of damp earth and pine sap, and I could feel the isolation pressing in before I even saw the cabin. The cabin itself was smaller than I expected, a single story with a loft, built from dark cedar logs that had weathered to nearly black in some places. A faint scent of mildew lingered in the air, mixed with the earthy tang of the forest. The windows were small, single pane, and frost had already begun to form along their edges. Inside, the layout was simple. A small kitchen with a wood stove and a sink, a table with 2 chairs, and a loft above with a thin mattress, blankets, and a pillow. There were no electronics beyond the weak cellular signal I could barely reach with 1 bar. It felt almost absurdly old-fashioned, but exactly what I wanted. A place where I couldn't scroll, couldn't be found, couldn't be distracted. I arrived just before sunset. The forest was quiet, too quiet, the kind of silence that makes your ears ring if you listen too closely. Not a single bird called, no wind rustled the branches, only the crunch of my boots on frost-hardened leaves. I unpacked slowly, taking deliberate care to put things away and make the small space feel mine. I chopped wood for the stove, feeling the weight of the axe in my hands, the clean resistance of the logs as they split. The sound of the fire catching, of the stove warming, was comforting, grounding me. I cooked a simple pasta meal and ate alone, the silence settling around me like a blanket. By 10, I was curled in the loft with the fire glowing below, staring at the flames, feeling a kind of peace that had eluded me for months. For the first time in a long while, the world outside my own skin faded, and I could just exist. Around 2 in the morning, I woke to a faint creaking from the porch. At first, I assumed it was the old wood settling, the way it always did with temperature changes and frost. But then the sound repeated, slow and deliberate, like someone testing the boards with careful steps. My body froze. I listened, straining to hear more, but the noise stopped again. My mind raced through rational explanations. Animals, wind, branches brushing the roof. None of them fit perfectly, but I tried to convince myself it was nothing. Then came a soft but firm knock on the door. My heart jumped. It wasn't frantic, it wasn't desperate. It was measured, precise, deliberate. I froze, staring at the dark wooden door as if it might explain itself. My phone sat on the table, one lonely bar blinking weakly. I debated calling the sheriff, but giving away my exact location, tucked deep into the forest, felt reckless. The knock didn't come again for a long time, but each time I allowed my thoughts to drift toward sleep, it returned. Slow, purposeful, testing the resolve of the cabin as if it were trying to figure out if someone was inside. I gripped the small hatchet I had next to the stove, knuckles whitening, chest tight. Time stretched thin in the stillness, each minute longer than the last. I tried to convince myself that by morning, it would be gone, just a fluke of old boards and shadows. But the feeling of being watched, of someone or something measuring the cabin from the outside, refused to leave. I didn't sleep. I moved as little as possible, listening. The world outside remained a silent, frozen void. Occasionally, a branch would crack in the distance, a reminder that the forest was alive. But none of those sounds explained the knock. Dawn felt distant, a concept more than a reality. Eventually, the first light crept over the treetops, pale and gray. I finally forced myself to leave the loft, stepping down carefully onto the floor. The cabin smelled of wood smoke and dampness. My boots crunched in the frost as I went outside, circling the cabin slowly, inspecting the perimeter. Every step I took left a mark in the thin layer of frost, but there were no others. No footprints, no broken branches, no disturbed leaves. The forest stretched endlessly in every direction, empty and silent, except for the occasional distant crow. I walked around twice more, scanning every angle, touching every surface I could reach. Nothing. It was as if the knock had existed only in my imagination, or as if whoever or whatever had come had left without leaving a trace. I packed up that morning. Every movement was careful, precise, my hands trembling slightly with adrenaline. I burned the last of the wood in the stove to mask any scent, left the cabin as neat as I had found it, and drove away along the dirt roads, headlights cutting through the thinning fog. The forest remained quiet behind me, oppressive in its stillness. Even with the warmth of my car, the sun climbing above the treetops, I couldn't shake the memory of the slow, measured knock, the way it had felt deliberate, intentional, testing me. I questioned myself endlessly on the drive back. Could it have been a hiker, a hunter, someone checking cabins for break-ins? But no signs remained. The snow and frost had recorded nothing. There were no indications of anyone being there besides me. It was maddening, and the uncertainty gnawed at me as I crossed back into civilization. The roads straightening, the houses returning, the sun fully warming the world. Even now, months later, I can remember the texture of the cabin walls, the smell of the damp cedar, the echo of the knock on the door. I don't know if it was a person, an animal, or just my mind pushing fear into the empty spaces. But I know that I will never stay alone in a cabin again. The forest, silent and patient, holds its secrets well, and I had brushed against one of them. The experience left a weight in my chest, a caution etched into my nerves. I learned that isolation can be both a balm and a danger, and that even the most carefully chosen solitude can hold a quiet menace. It didn't matter whether the threat was real or imagined. The fear was enough to make me leave, and that memory, that feeling of being watched, has never fully left me. I had been looking forward to this solo weekend in the cabin for months. The place was a small, isolated structure tucked deep in the woods about 2 hours outside of town. I had picked it from a listing online, mostly because of the promise of silence, thick trees, and a little lake nearby. My job had been crushing me lately, and I needed a few days to just breathe without anyone demanding anything from me. I packed light: a backpack with clothes, a small cooler with food, water, a flashlight, some batteries, and a first aid kit. My car was loaded, and the drive there felt good, the kind of long, winding road where you could see deer cross the asphalt and feel like the world was slowing down. The cabin itself wasn't fancy. It had a small living area, a wood-burning stove, a single bedroom, and a loft with a view of the trees. The electricity worked, but only in small doses, which suited me fine. The water came from a well, and there was a small outhouse near the back. The first night, I lit a fire in the stove, poured myself a cup of coffee, and just stared out the window. The woods were dark, deep, and dense. Even though it was late summer, the trees made the place feel like a shadowed fortress. The only sounds were the occasional bird or frog and the wind brushing through the leaves. I slept well that night, exhausted by the week I'd had. The next day, I decided to explore the area around the cabin. There was a narrow trail that led to the lake. I walked for about an hour, taking in the smell of wet earth and pine, listening to the soft snap of twigs under my boots. The lake was small, the water clear but still, like a mirror. No one else was around. I sat on a rock near the edge for a while, throwing small pebbles in the water, enjoying the quiet. By the time I headed back to the cabin, the sun was already dipping behind the trees. That night, things began to feel different. I had started a fire in the stove again and was cooking some canned beans over it. The wind outside had picked up, and the cabin creaked as the gusts pushed against the wooden frame. At first, I didn't think much of it. It was normal for old cabins to groan. But then I heard something else. A low, dragging sound, like someone walking heavily through the underbrush. I froze and listened. The sound moved around the cabin slowly, never coming straight up to the door, just circling. My heart started racing. I told myself it was probably an animal, deer maybe, or a raccoon, but something about the rhythm of it didn't feel natural. It wasn't skittering or quick. It was deliberate. I locked the cabin door and drew the curtains, sitting close to the stove with my flashlight. Every now and then, I would hear the dragging sound again, moving slowly past the windows. I told myself to stay calm. I had a phone, but the signal was patchy. It was enough to check the time or weather, but a call might not go through. I tried to keep myself busy by cleaning up the kitchen and restocking firewood, but my eyes kept flicking to the windows. The next morning, I thought the night had been just nerves. The forest looked the same in the sunlight, peaceful and almost friendly. I decided to take a longer hike, heading deeper into the woods to a ridge I had spotted on the map. I wanted to convince myself it was all just imagination. The trail was narrow and overgrown, and I had to duck under low branches. I passed old tree stumps, piles of leaves, and the occasional animal track. As I reached the ridge, I could see the cabin in the distance, tiny and isolated among the trees. The view made my stomach drop in a good way. It was beautiful and quiet. I stayed there for a while, listening to the wind, feeling the sun warm my shoulders. By the time I returned to the cabin, something had changed. The door was slightly ajar. My stomach dropped instantly. I was sure I had locked it. I approached slowly, keeping my hand near my pocket where my knife was. Nothing seemed to be inside when I peeked in, but the place felt off. Drawers that I was certain I had closed were slightly open. The fire I had left smoldering the night before had been knocked over, leaving soot marks on the floor. My cooler had been nudged to the side. Someone had been in my cabin. I called the police. The signal was weak, and I had to move around the property to get a bar or two, but eventually, I got through. They told me they couldn't send anyone out immediately, but they advised me to stay inside, lock all doors, and keep myself safe. I spent the rest of the day watching the woods from inside the cabin, peeking through the curtains, waiting for anything unusual. My nerves were taut. Every rustle, every branch snapping under wind pressure, set me on edge. That night was worse than the first. The dragging sound returned, louder this time and closer. I could hear it circling the cabin, stopping for a moment, then moving again. I grabbed my flashlight, knife, and a hatchet from the corner, just in case. I sat in the loft bedroom, listening, waiting. I didn't sleep at all. Hours passed. At some point, the wind died down, and the forest went completely silent. That's when I noticed something at the window. A pair of boots, standing just at the edge of the trees. I couldn't see a face, just dark pants and boots. I stayed perfectly still. After a few minutes, they vanished, moving back into the woods without a sound. Morning felt like a relief. The sun was bright, the cabin was still standing, and I was alive. I decided then that I wouldn't stay another night. I packed quickly, checking every corner, every room, making sure nothing was left behind. I kept my eyes on the treeline the entire time. The dragging sound never returned, and I didn't see the figure again, but the feeling of being watched lingered. The drive back was tense. Every shadow on the side of the road, every movement in the trees made me glance over my shoulder. I got home, locked the doors behind me, and didn't leave the house for the next 2 days. Later, I checked online. That area had occasional reports of illegal hunters and squatters. People would sneak into cabins, steal supplies, or just camp illegally. It made sense. What I had experienced wasn't supernatural, wasn't a story. It was human. Someone had been watching, testing, maybe trying to scare me. I realized how lucky I had been that they hadn't tried to break in further or confront me. After that trip, I never went back to that cabin. I learned to respect the isolation of the woods, to always trust my instincts, and to remember that danger doesn't need magic to feel terrifying. It was real, human, and all too close. That experience stayed with me for years. The silence, the dragging sound, the figure in the shadows. I still think about it whenever I'm alone in nature. I had been planning the trip for months. A week alone in the remote woods of northern Vermont to escape the weight of city life. The apartment I shared with roommates had become a cage, the walls pressing in with every day spent staring at screens, crowded streets, and endless noise. I needed space, silence, and the kind of isolation that demanded focus, where the only thing I had to face was myself. The cabin I rented was small and old, tucked into the forest along a dirt road that faded into nothing after a few miles. The GPS barely led me there, the last stretch marked only by faint tire tracks and pine trees so thick they swallowed the sun. When I arrived, the cabin looked smaller than the photos suggested, made of dark cedar logs that smelled faintly of resin and mildew. The windows were streaked with age, and a thin layer of frost clung to the roof. The first day was spent settling in. The wood stove required careful attention, and the stack of firewood outside was damp from recent rain. I chopped and carried it inside, arranged the pieces with care, and lit the stove for warmth. The smell of burning pine filled the cabin as I prepared a simple meal of rice and canned beans. By evening, the air had grown colder, and the sun dipped low, leaving the forest in a dense, blue shadow. Sitting on the small cot in the loft, I could hear the wind weaving through the trees, a low and constant hum that seemed alive. It was soothing at first, the kind of quiet I had forgotten existed. But as the night deepened, I noticed subtle shifts. The rustle of leaves when there should be no wind, the faint snap of a branch that echoed like a gunshot in the stillness. I slept fitfully, waking often to the sounds of the forest pressing against the cabin. In the morning, frost covered the windows, and the light filtering through the trees was weak and gray. I dressed and went outside, stepping onto the uneven ground littered with pine needles and broken twigs. The air was sharp, each breath filling my lungs with cold clarity. I walked along the small clearing around the cabin, marking familiar features. A fallen tree to the left, a boulder half covered in moss, a narrow trail leading deeper into the woods. Everything felt more deliberate out here, as though the world had slowed down to make me notice details I had never noticed before. The following days followed a pattern. I chopped wood, drew water from a nearby creek, cooked simple meals, and spent hours sitting by the window watching the forest. It was both beautiful and oppressive. The trees were static, yet there was movement everywhere. Insects crawling along bark, birds flitting between branches, squirrels darting noisily along the ground. But there were moments when the forest seemed to hold its breath, moments when the usual background noise disappeared, leaving only the silence inside the cabin. I started noticing small anomalies. Footprints in the frost outside that I hadn't left, branches broken in ways that suggested someone or something had passed, faint depressions in the snow that were too uniform to be random. I kept telling myself it was animals, or perhaps I was imagining things, tired and lonely. By the fourth night, the sensation of being watched had grown stronger. I double-checked the locks on the door and windows, even though the cabin sat miles from any road. The wind howled through the trees, rattling the shutters, and the shadows stretched across the walls in strange, angular patterns. When I moved around the cabin, the floorboards groaned under my weight, a constant reminder of the structure's age. I found myself jumping at sounds that should have been ordinary. The creak of the roof as it settled, a small rock falling from the roof into the snow outside. My thoughts became cyclical, questioning every noise and movement. During the day, I tried to distract myself. I collected firewood, filled the stove, and organized supplies. I even explored the forest further, following the trail that led away from the cabin. The trees became denser, the light dimmer, and the ground uneven with roots and rocks. I lost track of time, realizing only when I returned to the cabin that shadows were lengthening. The isolation was deepening. Even the birds seemed absent. I began marking my movements with small piles of stones, ensuring I could find my way back if I ventured too far. There was no immediate danger, yet the tension was constant, pressing against me in waves. On the sixth night, the fear reached a peak. I was awake long after midnight, sitting on the cot with the fire low. A pattern had emerged. At regular intervals, I could hear something moving outside. Not animals, not wind, but deliberate steps. The sound came in bursts, approaching, stopping, receding. My heart would spike each time, and I kept the axe I had sharpened close to the stove. Hours passed this way. I did not sleep, only listened, watching shadows shift across the walls. Dawn finally arrived, pale and thin through the frost-covered windows. I stepped outside and saw the footprints again, small, deliberate, human-sized, leading to the tree line and back. There was no sign of who or what had made them, no evidence beyond the impressions in the snow. The final day was spent preparing to leave. I packed the few belongings I had brought, stacked remaining firewood for the next renter, and swept the cabin. My nerves were frayed, my senses hyper-alert. As I walked toward the dirt road, I looked back at the cabin, noticing the way the trees leaned in slightly, as though listening. The forest was still, no footprints visible now, no movement beyond the ordinary. The tension that had plagued me began to dissipate with each step away from the clearing. By the time I reached the main road, the sound of distant traffic reminded me of civilization, and the solitude of the past week seemed both oppressive and strangely clarifying. Driving back, I replayed the week in my mind. The cabin had been safe in the literal sense. No one had entered, no threats had materialized, but the isolation had forced me to confront unease I hadn't noticed in the city. The fear had been real, grounded in the uncertainty of human perception, the small details that became amplified when alone in an environment without distraction. I realized that the cabin had not trapped me. I had trapped myself in the tension, in the patterns of thought that spiraled with nothing to interrupt them. By the time I returned to the city, I understood the purpose of the trip. It had stripped away comfort and familiarity, leaving me to face both the calm and the fear inherent in quiet solitude. The cabin, the forest, and the frozen nights were vivid, tangible experiences I would carry with me. Reminders that fear often emerges not from danger, but from the mind's response to silence, isolation, and uncertainty. The memories were precise. The feel of frost under my boots, the smell of burning pine, the rhythmic creak of the cabin settling, and they were enough to teach me that reality, in its rawest form, could be as unsettling as any story, yet ultimately, it passed, leaving clarity in its wake. The trip ended with the certainty that I would return to solitude on occasion, better prepared, aware of the limits of perception, and more patient with the slow unfolding of fear and resolution. The cabin was left behind, silent, ordinary, and yet indelibly marked in my memory. A place that had demanded attention, courage, and reflection, and that had, in the end, offered clarity through the simple, relentless presence of being alone.